Hello everyone, I'm Jessica McLeod and today I'm going to be talking about William Shakespeare's first folio. I'm sure most of you are somewhat familiar with Shakespeare's life and works, so I'm just going to go over a brief timeline to give us a sense of the period we're talking about. Shakespeare's actual birth date is unknown, but records show that he was baptized in Stratford-upon-Avon on April 26, 1564. We can assume he was born a few days prior to that. In 1582, at the age of 18, Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway, who was already pregnant with their first child. Despite starting his family in Stratford, Shakespeare knew that he needed to be in London for his career to take off, and so he split his time between the two cities as an adult. It is believed that he started his career as an actor, a playwright, a poet, and a partner in a leading acting company between the years of 1585 and 1592. The first quarto editions of his plays began appearing in 1594, and I'll talk more about those in the next slide. Shakespeare retired to Stratford in 1613 and died only 3 years later in 1616 at the age of 52. During Shakespeare's lifetime, his plays were printed in the quarto format. A quarto is a small book made by folding printed sheets twice to create 4 double-sided leaves, or 8 pages. The size would be comparable to a modern-day hardcover book. Quartos were used to print individual plays. They were printed with cheap materials and they had a flimsy construction, as plays were seen as trivial and not really worth the higher quality printing. About half of Shakespeare's plays were printed this way. People could purchase the quartos for about 6 pence at bookshops located in St. Paul's Churchyard in London. The first quartos started appearing in 1594, before including authors' names in the title page was common practice. Instead, the title page highlighted the acting company that first performed the play. This is an image of the title page for the quarto edition of Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus. Throughout this presentation, you can pause the video to study the images a little more closely. Here you'll notice that Shakespeare's name is absent from the title page. Before we talk about Shakespeare's first folio specifically, I want to take a moment to talk about folios generally. A folio, in comparison to a quarto, is a large book that's made up of printed sheets that are only folded once to create 2 double-sided leaves, or 4 pages. The size would be comparable to a modern-day coffee table book of photography, for instance. Folios were more expensive and seen as more prestigious than quartos because they were typically only used for things like Bibles and works of heraldry or history. These more serious works made up the high-end part of the book market. During Shakespeare's life, it would have been a completely radical idea to compile a collection of plays in vernacular English into the folio format. So how did we end up with a folio of Shakespeare's work? In 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, his friends and colleagues John Hemming and Henry Condell worked together to collect, edit, and publish almost all of Shakespeare's plays into a folio titled Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies. Though scholars wonder how Shakespeare spent his last few years in retirement, it is generally believed that it was not his idea to collect and publish his works in this manner. Rather, Hemming and Condell, wanting to memorialize their friend and his work, might have been inspired by Ben Jonson's 1616 publication of his own plays and poems. Hemming and Condell used the folio to group Shakespeare's plays into comedies, histories, and tragedies for the first time ever. It contains 36 plays, 18 of which had never been printed before. In their editing, they heavily utilized good quartos, and they took the opportunity to correct bad quartos, which were poorly recreated from memory. Roughly 750 copies of the first folio were produced and sold for up to £1 apiece. Each copy was slightly different because manuscripts were proofread and corrected throughout the entire printing process. It took 9 years for this first round of printing to sell out and require a second printing. Here's an image of the opening pages of the first folio. It includes an introductory poem written by Ben Jonson and an engraving of Shakespeare by Martin Droeshout. One interesting feature of the first folio is that the cover could be anything that the purchaser wanted it to be. The pages were sold unbound and had to be taken to a bookbinder. However, many other features of the first folio would be familiar to readers today. It included an introductory poem, an engraving of Shakespeare's likeness, a preface by the editors, Heming and Cundell, where they address a great variety of readers, a table of contents, and a list of principal actors who performed the plays, including Shakespeare himself. Here are some close-up images of the introductory poem and the list of actors. The legacy of the first folio, of course, is that we're still reading and performing Shakespeare's plays today. The folio was the first collection of Shakespeare's plays ever created, and it sustained his work in a way that performance alone could not. It ensured that countless generations would enjoy the plays, and it ensured that 18 of them, including The Tempest and Macbeth, would not be forgotten over time. Shakespeare invented many words and expressions that we still use today, thanks to the first folio. Contemporary works such as West Side Story and The Lion King were inspired by Shakespeare's work. And globally, Shakespeare's plays are still being performed in a variety of ways. I do want to talk a little bit more, though, about how the first folio created a new audience for Shakespeare's work, that of readers rather than playgoers. Heming and Cundell created a true readership for Shakespeare's plays. They wanted to bring the plays to people who might not have had access to the performances due to not living near theaters or the complications that came about because plays were only ran for a short time, typically only up to 9 days. By printing the plays, Heming and Cundell were able to give depth to them by including notes that included context, definitions, and references for readers. Readers could get a better understanding of the play by reading at their own pace. They were given the chance to pause, reflect, and go back to various scenes. That's something you can't do when you're just watching a play. Readers were also given the chance to interpret the plays through their own imaginations rather than through a director's, and they had the advantage of having the entire text before them. Some of Shakespeare's plays are over 3,000 lines long and have lines omitted so that the shows don't run over 4 hours long. Ultimately, the folio transformed Shakespeare's work from a theatrical experience into a literary one, and it honors the act of reading plays, something that we still do to this day. Thanks for listening. This slide includes the references that provided the information for this presentation.